Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Andreas Krieg, who's an assistant professor at the Defence Studies Department of King's College London. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor. The Global Chemical Warfare Watchdog, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, has only just begun, it's only just arrived in Syria to begin a fact-finding mission in Douma. And therefore, there are quite a lot of people who are pretty surprised that the airstrikes should have taken place this morning, just the day after they actually arrived in the country. What are your thoughts as to what the rationale was behind the timing? Why this morning and not wait a bit longer?
Yes, I mean, I think Donald Trump made it very clear from the beginning that he would take a different course in Syria than his predecessor Obama, who had a lot of red lines in the sand that were repeatedly broken without any retaliation or without any consequences. And Trump made it clear that he wants quick consequences. And that's just in the nature of the new Trump administration. Macron himself said as well that, they don't want to wait for too long. And I think that we had already more than 10 days of in between where there have been a lot of talks on strikes coming up, but nothing actually happened. So we had this building of force, we had the show of force, and nonetheless, the Assad regime, as well as the allies, haven't really reacted to it. So something had to happen at some point. And also, I think we need to be clear that there is absolutely no consolidated and substantiated evidence yet that these chemical weapons were actually used by the regime, as your analyst said before. But we have a whole long list of users of chemical weapons in Syria, which were directly affiliated to the regime over the last couple of years. So it's really a punitive action against the Assad regime for all the other breaches of international law and international norms that have taken place over the last couple of years. It's not really just a direct reaction to what happened in Douma. It's a new president with a new policy that said that every time something like this happens, we will take action. He's done so last year. He's done so this year.
Okay, so punitive for all the chemical weapons attacks up until this point. Do you think more punitive in a sort of symbolic way, or in a way that's actually going to make a meaningful difference to the Assad regime and its potential? The crux of my question is, does this really make any difference to the fact that President Bashar al-Assad is continuing to gain ground in his country, retake territory, and looks like he's set to continue to do so?
I mean, this is a very clearly bound strike, bound in terms of time, bound in terms of the objective. So as everybody said, this was not an intervention into the civil war. So it's not going to make any major difference in the way that this war is going to, roll out in the next coming month and years. What this is more of a statement. It's a statement that the West, despite all the allegations that the West cannot take any action anymore, that liberalism is on decline, that liberal values are in decline, that the values of the UN charters are in decline, that NATO and NATO partners can still take action. But I completely agree, this is symbolic in nature. It's making a statement that we have red lines and we will enforce them. It's not about deterrence. I don't think the Assad regime is deterred. I don't think it deters them from using chemical actions in the future. At the same time, it's not about denial either. I don't think that the Assad regime is now hampered in using chemical weapons. I'm pretty sure there will be still stockpiles available, and there's still vehicles available to actually launch them onto civilians. So I don't think it's the last chemical strike that we've seen. But it's a statement of saying, if you do it again, we will punish you again. And it's more of a symbolic statement. It's trying to compel the Assad regime from not doing this again and saying that this is something, we will stand up for what we say. But to be honest, looking at how many red lines, how many threats have actually been made over the last couple of years and how few of these threats were actually followed up, I think long term, I'm not very sure whether the Assad regime will actually take this as a very credible threat.
Professor, there is a school of thought that this conflict is essentially about optics. Won't an attack like this encourage regional players like Iran, like Hezbollah, and even further afield, the Russians, to actually step up their support for Bashar al-Assad? We've already had words of warning from the Russians today saying that they may now provide the Syrians with the S-300 missiles.
Right. I think this has happened already. I think we as the West have lost control over Syria a long time ago. And what we've done today, or what the West has done today, hasn't really changed that. And I do believe that Iran and Russia will get very much bogged down in Syria even further. And with allegations or with certain statements by the Trump administration to withdraw from Syria, we've actually just reinforcing the Russians and the Iranians to get further integrated in Syria. And I think this is what's going to happen. The Iranians and the Russians have made it clear that they do want a regime to stay that is prone or pro their interest in the region. Whether this is the Assad regime or some other regime which is run by someone else but is pro-Russian and pro-Iranian is a different question. I think that Western interests in Syria are no longer being protected beyond the scope of these weapons. And let's not make another thing we have to bear in mind. The West is making a clear statement saying, please don't use chemical weapons. But the West doesn't make a statement saying you're not allowed to use barrel bombs, you're not allowed to use artillery, you're not allowed to basically besiege civilian areas and starve people to death. All these things, which are also war crimes, have not been addressed and are not being addressed at the moment. So it leaves a lot of leeway and a lot of free room and wiggle room and maneuver for the regime to continue what they're doing, just using different and still very horrible means to achieve their ends.
Professor, the war of words even continues. Potentially, so do these strikes. Now, do you feel that potentially using economic or diplomatic measures, as hinted by the US President Donald Trump, is the final answer here?
The question is for a final answer for what? Does the West really have national interest, vital national interest concerns in Syria? I would say no. Whether removing Assad is actually very high on the priority list, I actually doubt this. It's primarily about terrorism. The narrative in the West has actually changed in 2013-14 to actually fighting jihadism, fighting Al-Qaeda, and fighting ISIS afterwards. It has moved away from removing the Assad regime. Regime change, and that's something that the Pentagon said today very clearly, regime change at the moment is not on the paper. Nobody's talking about it. So I don't really think that further afield that, we have to pressure the regime, but really everybody's behind the UN and the UN effort to try to find a diplomatic solution to this. But very little is actually being done. So there's this narrative of saying we support the UN in achieving a diplomatic solution in Syria, but in reality, very little is being done. So I really doubt the intentions of the West and the Western community to really make a difference. As long as it's not about terrorism or it's not about refugees, I think the West has been very, very quiet about what's going on in Syria and will probably continue to do so.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Andreas Krieg, Assistant Professor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. Thanks again.